Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Darren Freeby-Jones, and my co-host is Rachel Arnstead. And for this episode, we're exploring the topic of Shakespeare's villains. Who's the baddest of them all? And I wonder, Rachel, if you could get the ball rolling with some thoughts on early modern perceptions of villainy and vice.
You bet, because it's one thing to say that somebody is a villain, but what exactly makes a villain, right? What makes somebody bad in our view, and more importantly, in the view of Shakespeare and his audiences. So first, we're going to start way at the beginning with what is villainy? And there are two words that we tend to combine with that. One is vice and one is villainy. And they both come from the same Latin root, vidium. Now, originally, a vidium was a physical or structural defect, something that was wrong, something that was broken. And so this became something bad, a vice. There was a blemish or a vice about that. And so this is really kind of the origin of where our ideas of what badness is comes from, that it's an intrinsic fault with a thing or a person. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we kind of go forward and think about, uh, you know, what gets interpreted as brokenness in a person or a thing, because that's really kind of the crux of the matter here. Is a villain, is there something broken about them? Or are they just misinterpreted, right? That's kind of the question. So in in Roman thought, this began to be expanded to include like agricultural diseases. So then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, over hundreds of years, um, a vice became something that you could acquire, right? It wasn't necessarily something that was intrinsic to you. Um, Now, the word villain has a very classist root because originally a villain was simply somebody who lived in a village. And because village and all this, it all has this very agricultural root, if you'll forgive the pun. And so originally villains were just people who lived in villages. And that wasn't necessarily a evil thing. It was just something that if you were upper class, you didn't want to be. And so gradually, the word villain became worse and worse and worse until in our present day, it means absolute evil. And, part of this had to do with after the plague, to go back that far in, the mid 14th century, then villains became a thing of the past. It became sort of an old-fashioned way of talking about people, in part because there just weren't that many to be had. And you no longer had farmers have the same relationship to the land that they had for so long. People weren't serfs anymore. I mean, they were for a little while. Historians don't at me. I know it was a gradual process. But the end result of this was that farmers became kind of free agents eventually, as much as a farmer can be a free agent. They were no longer beholden to a lord and had to stay on that one particular piece of land. So, here we are in the present day, and again, more relevantly, Shakespeare's day, where a villain was still something uh, not just bad, but someone who was inferior from the moment they were born.
Hmm.
Uh, they were less than. And so this implies that it's an interior defect. Uh, when we think of villains today, we often think of somebody who had poor life choices or a bad childhood. We tend to have very Freudian interpretations of what makes a villain into a villain today. And
Mm.
a lot of those, because Freud was such a huge Shakespeare fan, uh, can be traced back to the way Shakespeare represented villains. He represented villains in this much more complex way, which we'll get into in a
Oh,
bit.
yes.
So I won't make any spoilers for our conversation in 5 minutes, but uh, one of the biggest villains of Shakespeare's day was Machiavelli. And Machiavelli gets a bad rap as far as I'm concerned. Uh, Historically, Machiavelli was basically a bureaucrat. And after the Medicis got kicked out of Florence, uh, basically for being tyrants and oligarchs and jerks, uh, they were gone for, I think, like 12, 14 years. And during that time, uh, Machiavelli had himself a nice, cushy government job. And he often went on diplomatic missions to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the King of France, representing Florence in all of these different capacities. Well, when the Medicis came back, they took everybody that had been in the government while they were gone and threw them into jail. And Machiavelli was one of these, and they tortured him and then sent him off, exiled him to uh, to his country estates, which sounds okay to me, but Machiavelli was not happy. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to be tortured, and um, he was very, very bitter. And this is when he did all of his writing. Machiavelli had a lot of time to write on hands. And one of the things, his most famous work was The Prince. He was definitely not the first to write basically a genre that was called advice to princes. And this had started, as far as we know, in ancient Greece. It may have started long before then, where basically some brave person or someone who just wanted to sell books would say, Dear so and so, this is how you be a good prince. Sometimes a work like that was commissioned by somebody to say, Hey, we've got this, 8-year-old crown prince. Could you write, Hey, Erasmus, you know, could you write a guide for princes and so on? So obviously nobody asked Machiavelli to write this book for the Medicis, but he did. And he sent it to his publisher who said, I'm not publishing that. I'm not sending that to the Medicis. Are you, have you gone mad? And it was not published until after Machiavelli's death, when his wife was like, I gotta get some money in here somehow. Here's all of his works. And then it became a huge bestseller. And I think a lot of people have not actually read The Prince. And I understand why. It's not the most exciting tome unless you're seriously nerdy or actually a prince. Uh, but in it, everybody knows that he says it is better to be feared and loved. But nobody ever follows that up with the worst thing of all is to be hated because then you'll be deposed. Um, the other thing that we need to consider is that it may be satire, more holding up a mirror than trying to provide some kind of advice, saying, this is the kind of prince that you are behaving as. And so this is the only kind of advice that I can give you. But of course, the danger of writing satire is that it often gets misinterpreted as, again, anybody who's ever been on social media knows you can write something and you think you're being silly even to your friends, and then people take you seriously. And you have to go, oh, no, no, sorry, you don't know me. That's not at all what I meant, and so on. And so uh, I think we should really consider uh, how evil Machiavelli was. Nonetheless, at this point he's a verb and it's too late
Mm.
to go back and redeem him fully. But he's worth reading. I think it makes for a more nuanced and interesting perspective to think about, who was he really as a human being? What were his motivations as a human being? What was his situation? Who was he responding to? And what was he really trying to say in this? And my vote is that it was, satire, and he was doing his best to be obnoxious and rude to the people who had tortured him. I don't think he was genuinely trying to give them advice in how to be worse. All that
Mm.
aside, um, Shakespeare and, you know, his cohort thought of Machiavelli as the epitome of evil. And so that's where we're going to go from here.
Yeah, so I think that term Machiavellian, it becomes synonymous with the idea of a devious foe, the
Mm,
acquisition of power through unscrupulous means, often with little regard for Machiavelli's biography and actual
hmm
writings. But the Machiavellian villain does become a stock type and an archetype on the early modern public stage. And the prototypical Machiavellian schemer in Elizabethan drama is Lorenzo, who is the villain of Thomas Kyd's blockbuster, The Spanish Tragedy. So he's the son of the Duke of Castile. He's the brother of the play's heroine, Bellimperia. And he wants Bellimperia to marry his friend Balthazar, but Bellimperia has fallen in love with Geronimo's son Horatio. So Lorenzo commissions a couple of goons, Cerberine and Pedragano, to take Horatio out. And then what you see is the the bumping off of intermediaries that once their work is done, they're essentially dispatched. So Lorenzo organizes it that Pedrangano kills Cerberine, but is then caught by the watch.
mm,
And he says, we think of Shakespeare as this great wordsmith who enjoys a pun, but I think Thomas Kyd was pretty proficient with punning as well. So Lorenzo says to Pedrangano, having given him this commission to kill Cerberine, then shalt thou mount for this. And indeed, Pedrangano finds himself on the scaffold, and
mm,
he's been duped by Lorenzo into believing that a pardon is coming his way in a box which will be provided by a young boy,
mm,
a page. And it's a moment of genius black comedy from Thomas Kyd that he gives this page a prose speech in which he directs the audience and opens the box to reveal that there is nothing
mm,
inside this box. There is no pardon. So you have this Pedrangano figure mocking his executioner upon the scaffold. He is so sure
mm,
that Lorenzo is providing this pardon, and then the executioner turns him off, as the stage direction puts it. He gets hanged on
mm,
stage. So Lorenzo ends up at the conclusion of the play being cast within a play within a play
mm,
and stabbed on stage for real. And I think Lorenzo ignited a trend for Machiavellian schemers on stage. So Thomas Kyd's roommate, Christopher Marlowe, created some incredibly memorable Machiavellian schemers. You've got Barabbas in The Jew of Malta. You've got Mortimer Jr. in Edward II. You've got the Duke of Guise in The Massacre at Paris. And Marlowe goes so far, we did an episode on goats before, and I don't think I mentioned this one. In The Jew of Malta, serving as prologue, you have the ghost of Niccolo Machiavelli, and he comes out with some just absurd lines in an Elizabethan context, just typical of Marlowe, who was too daring to live long, I think. So Machiavelli's ghost says things like, I count religion but a childish toy, and oh, there is no sin but ignorance. So you've got these memorable Machiavellian schemers in plays by the likes of Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe. And then you've got Shakespeare's rival, as I often refer to him, Robert Greene, who always had his finger crushed on the popular pulse,
Hmm.
but was always willing to satirize what was trending in early modern drama, no matter how fresh that trend was. So he produces a couple of Machiavellian schemers who are somewhat parodic, I think. In Robert Greene's play, The Scottish History of James IV, you have a schemer named Achukin, and we learn that he he possesses annotations upon the works of Machiavel. And in Robert Greene's Orlando Furioso, from which he draws from Ludovico Ariosto's epic poem, just as Shakespeare later would with As You Like It. You have the staging of the figure Sacripant, who has designs on the Princess Angelica, as well as the crown of France. But what Green does a little bit different with Sacripant is at the end of the play, Sacripant is repentant. He's a repentant Machiavellian schemer. So I think Green there is blurring some lines. He's complicating audience perceptions of on-stage villainy. And I think he actually paves the way in some respect for the heaps of contradictions we see with some of Shakespeare's villains, that
Hmm.
more complex characterization that we get with Shakespeare. So there's a long line of very memorable Machiavellian schemers already in the
Hmm.
repertoire before Shakespeare turns up on the scene and starts writing most likely in the early 1590s.
So, what kind of differences I mean, are there big differences between the way Shakespeare wrote villains and the way Marlowe and Kidd wrote villains? Do you see a
I,
shift
I
there?
do, I do that. I've talked about Robert Greene schemers as paving
Hmm.
the way for Shakespeare, but they're not as infleshed as Shakespeare's character. That yes, you do have repentant schemers, but the great thing about Shakespeare, for me subjectively, or one of the great things about Shakespeare, is that his heroes often have some darker characteristics, and even his darkest villains
Hmm.
tend to have some redeeming features. So I think Shakespeare's characterization is just so much more complex than
Hmm.
the likes of Kidd, Marlowe, and Green, if I'm being honest.
Well, I think too that we're looking at a really interesting time period for when the idea of evil is
Yes.
shifting
Yeah.
because the kind of Catholic version of what is evil is that, it all comes from the devil, it all comes from Satan, and that this was an outside force that was influencing people, making them do bad things, and therefore could be expelled. You could, move the person away from the contagion, and they would go back to being good people again. But with the onset of Protestantism, uh, that shift completely changed it. It was now that evil was interior. It was a flaw within that person. There was something wrong with that person. And so it wasn't enough to move that person away from the devil. You had to move that person out of the community. And so it shifted greatly um, how justice was carried out, what mercy meant in that circumstance. And because there was a lot of predeterminism wrapped up in Protestantism, and still is, if you look under, look at the layers of what it what the dogma actually is, this is where you begin to see the real rise in witch hunting and everything else in Scotland, where it really started in Germany, both Protestant strongholds. because all of a sudden there was no, oh, we just have to move this woman away from Satan or this man. Uh, but instead it's like, oh no, that person is inherently evil and needs to be burned at the stake. And so I think we start to see in Shakespeare this real question of what is going on inside of the person. And, perhaps because Shakespeare was just of a generation where that was the question at hand. And who knows why Shakespeare was so good at what he did, right? It's like Robert Graves says, yeah, I've probably said this before, but um, Shakespeare is good in spite of all the people who say he's good. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
he really was good at writing these characters. And I think, a lot of that has to do with him being an actor
yes,
and understanding what it takes to inhabit another character. Um,
absolutely.
you know,
Yeah, and I think he's fascinated by that question of are villains on necessity? And very
hmm
interesting what you're saying in terms of being sent out of communities or being outsiders in communities or being
hmm
othered. And that's applicable to so many of his villains. When you think of his bastards, Edmund,
hmm
Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, and what is arguably his earliest Machiavellian schema, which is Erne the Moor.
hmm
So this Moor character inhabiting the Roman society, and I was talking about repentant Machiavel's paving the way for Shakespeare, but Aaron in Titus Andronicus is utterly unrepentant.
Yes.
If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul. Titus
hmm
Andronicus probably says a lot about me. One of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I like to refer to it as the Quentin Tarantino movie of the
hmm
Shakespeare canon, but I'm probably doing a disservice to Julie Taymor's brilliant 1999 production. But it's got decapitation, mutilation. It ends with a mother being tricked into eating her own sons who've been baked in a pie. It's got 14 deaths in total, so very much accords with my bloodthirsty entertainment nature. But I love Aaron the Moor. I think he's a delicious bastard, and he is horrendous.
hmm
Arguably the darkest villain in the Shakespeare canon. He's got a predilection for pyromania. He will set
mm
barns and haystack on fire in the night, and he will dig up dead people and set them upright at their best friends' doors. He's a tutor figure. He instructs Hiram and Demetrius on ravishing Lavinia and murdering her
hmm
lover. He sets up Titus's sons. He tricks Titus into cutting off his own hand
hmm
in order to save the lives of those sons, something he finds utterly hilarious. So we could say, oh, this is cardboard villain. This is pure evil.
hmm
And yet, he has a child, of course,
Yeah.
with Tamara, the queen of the Goths. And Chiron and Demetrius have suddenly found themselves with a brother. And Chiron says to Aaron, "Thou hast undone our mother." And Aaron gives that classic early modern equivalent of a "your mama" joke. Villain, I have done thy mother. And then you have this nurse saying that we have to kill the child. If the
hmm
Emperor Saturninus discovers that Tamara has had an affair with you, this is going to be awful. So Aaron kills the nurse and then mocks her death thrones, which
hmm
is horrific, and then escapes with the child. And there's a very interesting moment where Aaron is captured by Titus Andronicus's son, Lucius, and a Goth recounts overhearing Aaron talking to the baby. And you see that Aaron is actually really caring, that there's a paternal side to
hmm
Aaron. So he's not totally evil. And Lucius, who is a classic ambiguous Shakespeare figure who is left to reconstruct society at the end of the play. And you often think, I think of Malcolm in Macbeth as well. You think,
Hmm.
really? You're
Yeah.
leaving this
How's that going to
in
work?
their
Yeah.
hands? Yeah.
Yeah.
But Lucius has this awful line where he says, hang the child first so he may see it
Hmm.
sprawl. And Aaron pretty much begs for the child's life and says, you let this child live, and I will give you information that will advantage thee. And that
Hmm.
information is just him revealing with utter glee what a complete git he has been during the course of the play. But a really fascinating character, Aaron, who is more complicated than we might suppose, who does have some sympathetic traits and also frequently draws attention to the fact that he's been stigmatized as a Moor
Hmm.
in that society that Shakespeare is representing in the play. So a brilliant Machiavellian schemer, Aaron, I think.
So I have often had the thought that Titus Andronicus is really a Three Stooges script.
Mm.
What do you think of the possibility that it was played for laughs?
Well, I think it worked when it's played as
Mhm.
satire, when it's played for laughs, but I've also seen it work when it's played completely seriously.
Mm,
And I think this is something we've touched upon in maybe in our last episode on Fools, actually. The great thing about Shakespeare is that you go on a roller coaster of emotions
mhm,
with his tragedies, with his comedies, that there are moments of humor in Titus Andronicus, absolutely. But I also think it does work as a deadly serious Senecan bleak tragedy as well. So when it comes to creatives putting on this play, that I certainly wouldn't prohibit any approach. I think it can work
mhm,
as a as a complete sort of crazy zany Three Stooges approach, but it can also work played with deadly seriousness, I think.
mhm. Yeah, it's a rough one, and I think it's enjoying kind of a new resurgence
Yes. Yeah.
these days. I think in the wake of uh, Tarantino movies and other very kind of ultra violent, ultra
Well,
graphic kind of entertainment, it's a lot less shocking than
it's often regarded as an immature tragedy, but when you look at its critical
mm,
reception, it's not dissimilar to what I would say is, in my view, probably Shakespeare's magnum opus, his greatest work, King Lear. That I think a lot of, particularly in the Victorian period, people couldn't get on with plays like Titus Andronicus and King Lear simply because they couldn't
mhm,
really believe in that graphic violence. And then you have the world wars and the kind of violence that you can see unwillingly just through scrolling on social media today.
mhm,
I think there's a relatability with some of those horrific acts that you see in these plays, in the 14 deaths of Titus Andronicus or the plucking of Gloucester's eyeballs in King Lear. So I totally understand the critical resurgence for Titus Andronicus. It feels a lot less ludicrous than it might have, say, a
sure.
hundred or so years ago.
Well, and I think we have to remember too why the Victorians basically resurrected Shakespeare and
Mm,
exported him all over the globe. He was PR for the English Empire,
yeah.
and why would they send out these violent and tragic stories that might make people not think well of the English and Shakespeare and everything else. So, his function as propaganda for
Mm,
the Victorians probably held a factor
mm,
in that because I think the Victorians, I think they saw plenty of violence and
yeah,
blood
yeah,
and, you know, they certainly
yeah,
perpetrated plenty of it. That's to be
yeah,
sure, you know.
yeah.
So, but, that kind of brings us to an interesting point in that as unpleasant as it is to see bloodshed and the eventual uh, gory results of tyranny. The fact that we have that kind of media means that
mm,
we have a certain amount of freedom, of
mm,
artistic freedom in our society. Victorians
mm,
not known for their artistic freedom. Um,
mm,
you
mm,
know, a very repressive society. And
mm.
so maybe it's a good thing that we have all this bloodshed on our screens. I can't
Yeah.
watch it personally.
No,
I
but then
cannot
it's
handle gore. Um,
but when you're thinking about when you're anchoring Shakespeare in his original theatrical context, and you're thinking
mhm,
of it's been estimated 15 to 20% of Londoners would go to the public playhouses.
right.
But with any commercial business operation, you're going to have competition in terms of drumming
Hmm.
up business. And for a penny, which would fetch you a loaf of bread, you could go and watch someone getting hanged or someone getting beheaded, or you could go
Hmm.
to the bear baiting.
Hmm.
Interestingly, you have theatres that are doubling not just as playhouses, but also as bear pits. So
Sweep up
it's
the
always
blood and the
worth,
guts and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So it's always worth considering these plays
Very
in their
much so.
original milieu, I
Hmm.
think. And I guess
Definitely.
after Aaron, the major schema that stands out, I say after Aaron, this in terms of what we think of the chronology of Shakespeare's
Right.
plays, probably Richard III.
Mm.
And I think Shakespeare, when he comes to write this character, he's less interested in historical verisimilitude and veracity than devising an unforgettable Machiavellian schema. And I love tracing that character's arc during the Henry VI plays because you have so many Machiavellian schemas. You've got York, who's a brilliant character, and then you get these schemas falling in battle, and
Hmm.
Shakespeare's able to devote some sustained time to Richard's, and he
Well,
gives him some immensely long soliloquies.
I want to talk more about Richard, but I want to push back a little bit on the idea that Shakespeare was playing fast and loose with history, because he really wasn't. He cleaved very closely to his sources. So, as far as Shakespeare knew, he was making, essentially a documentary. Now, we should and do call it historical fiction, basically, but he doesn't promote any ideas specifically about Richard III that were not found in
Yes, yeah,
Holinshed and
Virgil and John Rouse, yeah,
Virgil and
yeah,
Thomas More and everybody else.
yeah.
And, you know, I get, and again, I'd like to do an episode on this. And, we hear a lot that Shakespeare was writing Tudor propaganda. I don't think so. I don't think he was writing it as some sort of cynical way to make the Tudors look better. There's a number of practical reasons why that doesn't work around Richard III. But, putting all that aside, people like Thomas More and, the many clerks who wrote Holinshed, they were interviewing people who were alive at the time. Um, they did not have to make Henry VII look like some sort of paragon, uh, in order for the Tudor line to be legitimate. There were people who genuinely hated Richard III while
Mm,
Richard III was alive, which is why Henry Tudor was able to get so many people to his side. He'd been off in Brittany for years. Nobody knew who he was. So I just want to put that out there. I think that Shakespeare, um, he compresses timelines. He's dramatizes events perfectly, but that's his job to do that. And so I don't think he was presenting Richard III in a way that would have seemed surprising to his audiences. Let's put it that
mm,
way. They
yeah,
already had that idea of Richard III in their minds, and that had he written Richard III as less of a villain, they would have gone, What are you doing? What are you talking
yeah.
about?"
And it is complex in terms of those sources for Shakespeare in terms of perceptions of Richard. And John Rouse is the
Mm,
historian that stands out to me as one who praised Richard during his reign.
mm,
And then when Henry was on the throne, said that he was born with a full set of teeth and shoulder length hair and was this kind of
mhm.
demonic creature. But I think my point is that Shakespeare buys an opportunity with Richard, and
Right.
there are antecedent plays. That there was the true tragedy of Richard III, where he is, very much an all-out villain. But I do get the sense that Shakespeare, he revels in meta theatre, and Richard is a very meta
Mm,
theatrical character.
mhm.
And I get the sense that Shakespeare's thoroughly enjoying
Yes.
writing his version of Richard III. That
Yes.
you've got these other schemers, they're out of the
Hmm.
way. He's then able to devote some time to this character who can add colours to the chameleon and can set the murderous Machiavel to school. He is subtle, false, and treacherous. And Richard III, I think he you could trace him to that notion of Machiavellianism. He's also very much an Elizabethan equivalent of the vice figure, that he devotes a lot
Mm,
of time talking to the audience, and particularly in Richard III, so interesting in terms of Shakespeare's craftsmanship that you've got these soliloquies, you've got Richard creating a relationship with the audience. And I think the audience are marveling at his nefarious schemes, even though they might also be appalled by those schemes. But Richard's speeches to the audience and his asides, they lessen as Richard III progresses. And you get the sense that there's a disconnection between Richard and the audience, Richard and the
hmm.
kingdom, once he's attained the throne, ironically, Richard and time. I mean, so frequently he asks, "What is the clock?" And
Mm,
it's a fascinating character arc because by the end of the play, of course, he is utterly isolated. He's alone on the battlefield, crying for a horse, and he's just a tremendous character, I think. And Shakespeare, I reckon he was looking at the likes of Thomas Kidd, looking at the likes of
hmm.
Christopher Marlowe, and saying, "Ah, Richard III, this is my crack at unforgettable Machiavellian villain." And no matter how controversial he might be from uh, modern
Hmm.
perspective, looking at it through a historical lens, he is an unforgettable villain who's as entertaining now. That's one of Richard's favorite words, I think. That's a word that frequently pings in the soundtrack
Hmm.
of Richard's mind now. He's as relevant and entertaining now as he ever was, I think.
Oh, I agree. And there wouldn't be so much controversy
Well,
if
precisely.
if he
Yeah.
wasn't, you know. I do want to touch on the idea of vice because this is something that I
Yes.
neglected to go into detail at the beginning of this episode, but we go into detail about it a lot in the previous episode on
Yes.
fools.
Yeah.
And but we can briefly say that the vice character was one in the medieval Catholic mystery plays who showed the audience the devil, who gave asides to the audience and revealed who the devil was. And so I think this is a really interesting insight on your part that i- in this case, the devil reveals himself, that he doesn't need a fool. There's no fool in Richard III. Can you think of a fool? Yeah, unless we're talking about the strawberry guy.
I'm just thinking of characters like Buckingham and anyone who goes along with Richard, I think, yes, they end up being fooled. But no, not in terms of that dramatic archetype, really. No,
Yeah, and that sort of specific asides to the audience
it's Richard who's the
role.
humorous character, isn't he?
Yeah, I
And
think
it's
Richard
dark
is his
humor, it's black
own
comedy.
fool. Yeah,
Yeah,
he is his
yeah.
own fool. That's pretty interesting.
And
Yeah.
interesting, we were talking about the idea of vitium, that
Mm-hmm.
idea of a defect or
Mm-hmm.
blemish. And of course, you've got those stereotypes where you have early moderners, quote, equating evil with deformity, and that's something
Hmm.
you see with Richard with his withered arm and his crook
And
back.
his crook back, which,
Yeah.
for years people thought, oh, well, maybe that got added on later. But then when they
Mm,
discovered his bones under a car park, which they thought he was there. I want to be clear that
mm.
some lady didn't just all out of the blue sort of psychically divine where Richard's body was. They knew he was probably under that car park somewhere. The fact that he was under the letter R is
Mm.
kind of spooky and interesting,
Yes.
but he was there for a long time and everybody knew it. They just couldn't be arsed to dig him up. And
It just makes me think of the prophecy that he's buzzing around about the letter G at the start of Richard III. So yeah, being planted under the letter R is fascinating, isn't
it
it?
really is. It really is. Yeah, you think, if there are ghosts and he was watching, would you laugh or cry at that point when somebody painted a big R over your corpse?
Yes, yes, yeah,
That is
yeah.
bizarre. All right, well, let's not linger too much on Richard because we have more villains.
Yes, well, if we can, I'd like to talk a little bit about Iago,
Mm-hmm.
who is quite possibly my favorite of
Mm,
Shakespeare's villains. And we were talking about the complexity of Shakespeare's characterization. One question that a lot of students I engage with, they will frequently ask and they will debate in the classroom is, why does Iago do what he does? Why does he want to
mm,
ensure Othello's downfall? And in Shakespeare's source material, Geraldi Cinthio's The Moorish Captain of 1565, Shakespeare had a very easy answer for that. So the ensign figure, the Iago figure, he fancies Desdemona, as she's called in Shakespeare's source. She rejects his advances and he wants revenge. But in Shakespeare's play, he gives us an all-you-can-eat buffet of interpretive choices. And you were talking about Shakespeare as an actor earlier. I think
mhm,
he knows what makes for a meaty role. Is it racism? Is it misanthropy? Is it an artistic impulse, as the critic A.C. Bradley supposed? Is it professional jealousy? Is it because Michael Cassio, Florentine that never set a squadron in the field, has been promoted above him?
mhm,
Is it, as critics such as Stephen Orgel have contended, is it in part because he harbors repressed homosexual desires for Othello?
mhm.
And I find it quite interesting that for me, Othello probably has the most homoerotic moments in any Shakespeare play. And you'll notice I use the
That's
word
going
play there.
something.
I'm not include. I say play, not including the sonnets, which are notoriously bisexual in tone,
Sure,
as some
sure.
critics put it. But you have that moment where Iago is talking about sleeping next to Michael Cassio, and he says
Mm,
he was kept awake with a raging toothache, which sounds a little bit euphemistic to me.
hmm.
And he talks of Michael Cassio speaking in his sleep, putting his leg over Iago, kissing Iago as if he plucked kisses by the roots. And I think chances are this is complete bullshit. Iago's a lying little toad. But you had the
Hmm.
actor Anthony Sher, great Shakespeare actor in 2004, play Iago as a bisexual character and
Hmm.
as a warped character who is sexually interested in anyone or anything apart from his wife Amelia. And on the subject of Amelia, another interpretation that Shakespeare gives us is when Iago says that it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets Othello's done my office.
Hmm.
So I think Shakespeare's great at hinting at prequels. And if there was a prequel to Othello, I think it would be called Iago.
Hmm.
And later in Othello, Amelia says to Iago, some such squire he was that turned your wit the seamy side without, and made you to suspect me with the more. So in my imaginary prequel to Othello, I think you'd have this mysterious squire figure whispering in Iago's ear.
Hmm.
So ironically, Iago seems to suffer from Othello syndrome. that irrational fear that your spouse has been unfaithful. So you could almost read Othello as something of a cyclical revenge tragedy that
Mhm.
Iago wants to put Othello through everything he has been put through himself. And I always feel like whenever I see Othello in performance, like a fly enmeshed in Iago's web at the end of the play, because he has as many soliloquies as Hamlet, seven soliloquies. He very much is the embodiment of the vice character. And having provided us with multiplicious interpretations, it feels very pointed when at the end of Othello he says, "What you know, you know." I always feel like he's talking to me in that moment. And it reminds me of you were talking about documentaries earlier as well. When you watch documentaries about serial killers, which I'm
Mhm.
quite interested in, that's my kind of thing. But there's power play in the
Mhm.
withholding of information that you will
Mhm.
often see from sociopaths and serial killers and so forth. And I think that's what we get with Iago at the end of that play. He is such a fascinating character who can be portrayed and read in so many different ways. And he is also a humorous character, I think. That
Mhm.
my favorite Iago that I have seen was Tim McInerney. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, 2007. And that actor was known for his comic prowess in Blackadder and so forth. Tremendous
Mhm.
actor. But I think he really got the balance right with
Mhm.
Iago, that he was terrifying precisely because he was so good at the kind of humorous banter that Iago can have with characters before he then turns to us and speaks this eloquent verse. And you have Michael Cassio saying to Desdemona when they arrive in Cyprus, "He speaks home, madam. You may relish him more in the soldier than in the scholar." And I think Iago is able to use that soldierly, colloquial discourse and his reputation for being exceedingly honest in order to use all of the characters in that play almost like chess pieces. So, yes, big fan of Iago right here.
I
Uh,
I
yeah,
do think it's interesting that we have that impulse to come up with a
mm,
reason, a
yes,
rationale for
exactly.
Iago's behavior. Because surely you have met people who were just that evil for no reason,
Bastards. Yeah, yeah.
right? I mean, I've had people who went around saying absolute nonsense about me in order to discredit me, and
Mm,
I hadn't slept with their spouse, you know. I
yeah,
hadn't
yeah,
I hadn't done anything like that. And so, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that people should stop looking for these reasons because
yeah.
it's rewarding and fruitful. But I think we also have to, consider the idea that he's just a bad person. He's just a nasty person who, for whatever reason, was a bully and decided to pick on Othello and found joy in making other people miserable. Um,
Yes, yeah. But this is the great thing about Shakespeare,
mhm,
and why I think he's so great for study as well. That actors playing Iago might sometimes struggle with that. They want their through line. They want
mm,
their motivation, darling.
mhm,
But I think in terms of us as students of Shakespeare, it ties into that John Keats quotation about Shakespeare's negative capability, that Shakespeare loves embracing ambiguity. And for me,
mhm.
he's not a didactic writer. He's not a moralist. He's a writer who loves raising questions, and we can come to those questions with our own personal informed responses.
And, we need to remember too that he was writing for a multiplicity of audiences. He
Yeah.
understood, in his actor's bones that a different character needs to be played differently to different audiences, and you need to present that. They may need different motivations, for all sorts of reasons. And so, Shakespeare gives his actors lots of room
Yes.
to tailor their performance to the community that they are performing it for. And thank goodness for that, because that's probably why we still have his plays
Oh,
to enjoy the
precisely.
day, you know?
Yeah, it's that
Yeah.
interpretive flexibility, isn't it, with
Hmm.
his characterization, or as we were saying earlier, with a play like Titus Andronicus, that you can
Hmm.
put on as one of the most harrowing theatrical experiences you will ever have, or
Hmm.
you can do it like the Three Stooges.
Hmm.
I don't think many
I would
playwrights are capable of that,
I would
really.
love, as an aside, I would love to see a Titus Andronicus Three Stooges with the sound effects
Mm,
and the music and everything
mm.
else. Um,
And
just to kind of
there have been musical versions of Titus
have there.
Andronicus.
Oh
There
gosh.
have, yeah, yeah. So,
Wow. Wow. See,
uh,
this is one thing where you living, in the UK get this embarrassment of riches of
oh,
Shakespeare performances,
infinite riches in a little country. Yes, yes. To paraphrase Marlowe, yes. But talking about Titus Andronicus, I guess leads us to the play I referred to as Shakespeare's magnum opus earlier,
Hmm.
which is arguably his bleakest tragedy, which is
Hmm.
King Lear.
Okay,
And
so now why you got to tell me why that is your favorite play before we get into,
oh, why King Lear is my favorite? Well,
yeah.
it's the play that I think got me to fall in love with Shakespeare, really. That I was a fan, but when I studied King Lear at the age of 16, 17 years
Mm-hmm.
old,
Mm-hmm.
I just thought this guy gets me. And I was only a teenager, and this is a play exploring the division of kingdoms, grief,
Mm-hmm.
age, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. But there was something about that play, and for me, the best Shakespeare plays, King Lear, Hamlet, his most interrogative plays. They're the plays that I will always find something new and sometimes completely shift my outlook each time I engage with them anew. And I think King Lear is just huge, colossal play.
So what is it like specifically? Was there a character? Is there a particular, is there this sort of doomed revenge arc for Cordelia? Um,
Mm. Yeah,
what
it
was
is.
it?
Well, I'm a big fan of the tragedies, as you know. I think it's the
Yeah.
nihilism of King Lear
Okay.
that it
Okay.
does that it is open to redemptionist readings, but it feels incredibly dark and barren at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the play. And I think Edmund is a terrific villain in that
Mm.
play. That's one of the reasons why I love it. And thinking about Edmund, it ties into so many things you were saying. The idea of villainy and early modern perceptions of villainy and Shakespeare's approach to villainy, because he's he's a complex character. And at the beginning of the play, um, I think he's such an intriguing figure that you have this brooding character standing on stage with Gloucester and Kent. And Edmund is usually the sexiest member of any cast of King Lear. And you have Gloucester speaking in excruciating detail about what a good lay his mum was,
Mm.
and that the whoreson must be acknowledged. And I think for modern audiences in particular, if you're coming to this play afresh, you must be thinking, what's going on in this
Mhm.
guy's mind? He's very polite. I will study deserving, or he just mutters monosyllables with good manners. And then you have this following another public humiliation where Lear humiliates his daughters during the love test. You have this wonderful soliloquy where he's saying, "Thou nature, art my goddess," and he comes across as almost atheistic. The scholar Ewan Fernie says that Edmund's atheism becomes almost its own kind of spiritual possibility, and you get a sense of generational conflict in King Lear. You have that older outlook. I think Edmund's dad, Gloucester, if he were alive today, would probably devote considerable time to reading the horoscope section in newspapers. And Edmund dismisses this. He says this is the excellent foppery of the world, that he doesn't necessarily believe there's something in the stars that makes him an evil character.
All right. Well,
And
so for those, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for those of us who have who have not been reading Lear since we were 16, um, give us a little rundown of what Edmund does.
Well, he's an illegitimate son, so he's a
Mhm,
bastard. So there's that when you're thinking of what is causing him to act the way he does, there's the social stigma of bastardy, and he has his brother Edgar, who is the legitimate child.
mhm,
So, as a Machiavellian schemer, he thinks I'm going to screw over my
mhm,
brother, and he forges a letter making out that Edgar is the Machiavellian schemer. So, in his father's eyes, he then and there was an inadvertent pun there. But in his father's eyes, he is the fine and natural boy, I think
mhm,
Gloucester calls him, and he gets Edgar out of the picture for a while. But then he betrays his own father, leading to Gloucester having his eyes plucked out.
mhm.
He plays the Lear's two daughters, Goneril and Regan, against each other, and they both fancy him. I called him a fanciable character earlier. Frankly, I don't think he gives a damn which sister he ends up with.
Mhm.
Neither can be enjoyed while the other remains alive, he
Mm.
says. And he also orders a captain near the end of the play to hang Cordelia, which is
Yeah.
arguably the most devastating moment in theatrical and literary history. It's a moment that the critic Samuel Johnson couldn't bear to reread. But at the end of the play, you have his brother Edgar turn up and they have a duel, and he doesn't realize that he is fighting his brother and is then slain by his brother. And what's quite interesting about Edmund that ties into what I was saying about repentant Machiavells in Robert Greene
Mm.
earlier is he says, "Some good I mean to do, despite of mine own nature." And he conveys the information about the order for Cordelia's execution. So he initiates this race against time that is ultimately failed, that Cordelia does end up dead. But it's very interesting, just that complete turn. The wheel is come full circle, he says.
Mhm.
The fact that he does repent as he's dying. And like I said, King Lear is open to redemptionist readings. How sincere do we take that moment of redemption? But Edmund, very much a focal point, I think, for Shakespeare's love of exploring the idea of nature versus nurture. That
Mm.
is he a villain on necessity, or particularly from a modern lens, are there, psychological reasons that if you had your father speaking about sleeping with your mother in excruciating detail, and you have those kind of paternal authoritarian, patriarchal authoritarian figures, that maybe you wouldn't turn out to be an absolute angel, just as
Mhm.
Goneril and Reagan don't either. So it's that kind of complexity, and he is just one of many incredibly complex characters that, for me, make King Lear Shakespeare's masterpiece.
Well, and it even brings up the question, does that does that redemption matter? Does his attempt at
Mm,
redemption really mean anything?
yeah.
If he says, "Oh, sorry," uh, you know, does he belong in heaven,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think in a sense that kind of questions that whole idea of, can you do evil your whole life, say sorry, my bad at the end, and then still go
Yes.
and
Yeah.
sit at the hand of God?
That's one of the great things about King Lear for me as well. And I think I was raised as a Catholic
Mm,
from a young child. Not a particularly, not really a religious family, but I did have a Catholic
mhm,
upbringing, and I'm very grateful for that
mhm,
because I love the stories I was taught. But when I was a teenager, I did become an atheist. And I think maybe in some respects that's why King Lear resonates for me, because it
ah,
raises so many questions in
mhm,
terms of what are the gods like? Are they cruel? Are they,
Mhm.
oh, you kind gods? Are there no gods at all? Thou swearest thy gods in vain. I think it's that religious aspect in
Mhm.
portraying this Brythonic ruler in King Lear with characters who do not yet have the tools of Christianity at their disposal. I
Right,
think it's just a fascinating play.
right. All right. Do you have shall we go on to who's next in your
Well,
chronology?
Macbeth would probably be next.
Hmm.
We think King Lear 1605,
Hmm.
Macbeth 1606, and I recall that when I first came up with my list of Shakespeare villains, you said we need to include Macbeth,
Hmm.
and rightly so. You were right to pull me up on that. And uh, Macbeth for me resembles Othello as a character in some respects. That for me, he starts off as something of this hero, this heroic warrior
Hmm.
character. And then, of course, by the end of the play, he's a murderous tyrant, and Othello is a wife killer. So I think the fascinating things and similarities with those two characters is that our ethical compass is forced to recalibrate during the course of those plays. But
Hmm.
I'm curious to hear what is it about Macbeth that really stands out to you that you thought he has to be on our list? Of course, this is one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, but what is it about Macbeth as a Machiavellian schemer that really stands out for you, Rachel?
Well, he sits at this really interesting nexus, and there's this sort of substrate that I don't think ever gets addressed, which is that Macbeth sits in this time period in between this sort of Celtic, what we refer to broadly as Celtic, uh, kind of land sovereignty kingship versus anointed kingship, and that Macbeth manages to offend both systems. He, if we look at the witches as this, kind of Celtic framework of how a king became a king, it was because the land in this sort of kind of goddessy uh, mindset in this worldview that the king marries the land. And so, in that context, when we see the witches saying, hey, Thane of Cawdor, hey, you're going to be king someday, in a sense, they are making a pronouncement. They are saying, you deserve to be king because we have recognized that in you. And he goes, oh, wild. This is great. I'm going to be king. And then, of course, goes home and tells his wife and everything else. But then he runs up smack against the anointed kingship
Yeah.
of England, right? And, let's remember that Macbeth is of the Scottish Highlands. And Scotland was not in any way a unified place at this point, certainly when Macbeth is set. And so even, you know, during Shakespeare's time, there was a prejudice against the Highlands. In other words, Lowland Scots looked down on the Highland Scots. And so, we understand that this play, kind of caters to James, uh, James the Sixth, because it's got witches, it's got Scotland, it's got everything, and manipulates the whole idea of James descended from Malcolm and all the rest, blah blah blah, and go into that in another time. But Macbeth manages to offend, uh, these much earlier Celtic ideals of what was appropriate behavior. You don't kill your guests, very important. Guest crimes, very serious. You don't kill women and children. And when the trees come, the land has literally risen against him. And I think that Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's time, people would have recognized that problem that Macbeth had, that not only had he offended the Christian God by killing an anointed king, but he'd also violated the guest taboo and the taboo against killing women and children. And I just think it's in this way, Macbeth is Shakespeare's most complete villain. He's made
Mm,
everybody mad. Like, theoretically, Othello had enemies, if
mm, mm,
he's a warrior, blah, blah, blah. There were
mm,
probably people, you know, uh, happy to see Othello dead or whatever, but everyone was happy to see Macbeth dead. Um,
mm.
I don't think there was a soul in Scotland at the time that would have been sad about him going. Nonetheless, as a historical figure, much maligned. The real Macbeth didn't do any of those things, and again, that's a character for that's a topic for another podcast.
Well, he was
But
he was able to go on holiday to Rome for a while, wasn't he? Which the historical Macbeth, which suggests that Scotland was fairly peaceful under him in comparison to
oh, it was
Shakespeare's version.
very peaceful. Yeah,
Yeah,
as far as we know, him and his Lady Gruash or
yeah,
Macbeth had a long peaceful reign for those days, more than
mm,
a decade, and you're doing pretty good uh,
yeah.
in medieval Scotland. And, but he got totally altered by a 16th century historian, Hector Boece, Hector, however you pronounce it, who rewrote basically the whole story of Macbeth in order to make the Stuarts look good. So um, that's a
Yes.
that's a whole other story. But again, Shakespeare did not make this stuff up. He was following his sources very closely, other than conflating um, two stories that he found within Holinshed of the deaths of two different kings. Um,
Well, we were talking about the complexity of Shakespeare's characterization, and even Macbeth, this bloodthirsty tyrant we could see him as, is not an all-out bastard. I think
mhm,
he's a character who undergoes something of a transmogrification, that he almost becomes monstrous. And you had the actor Jonathan Slinger, who played him in 2007, say that he is full of antitheses, that he is this character described as unseeming someone from the knave to the chop, and
mhm.
yet his wife says he is too full of the milk of human kindness. And so he is a very complex character, that he's not all out evil as Shakespeare presents him, that there is this remarkable character arc with him, I think, that he is given this opportunity fundamentally, and he takes it. And like you said, he offends everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he thought he had the blessings of the land. He thought he had the blessings of the goddess. And in some versions, the goddess Hecate shows up, and
Yes.
she's
Yeah.
an ancient Greek goddess of witchcraft and the night and justice and a number of other things. And of course, the general consensus is that Middleton wrote that scene, and so it gets cut a lot of the time, which I
Mm,
think is a mistake because
mm,
I feel like she presents this land sovereignty argument when she says to her witches, "You did not have the authority
mm,
to tell this guy he was going to be king. That's my prerogative to
mm,
decide who's going to be
mm,
king." And
mm.
besides, makes a great scene in terms
It
of
wo- it works
aesthetics.
great in performance. I've
Hmm.
seen it work so effectively, and Macbeth does reference Hecate or Hecate or Hecate, however you
We
prefer to
don't
pronounce
know.
that. Well, I think that the dramatists they sometimes vary from disyllabic to trisyllabic versions of the
Hmm.
name anyway. But Macbeth does invoke her when he has the
He
famous "Is
does.
this a dagger I see before me"
He
speech. So
does.
he speaks
And
about
we
Pale Hecate. Yeah.
and we can't assume that Shakespeare didn't want that scene in the play,
Mm,
right? I mean, we know Do we know for sure that that scene got added after he died? Is that
We don't
a
know for
done
sure.
deal?
This I've got an article on this. I spoke about in a previous episode, which is in Shakespeare Journal, called "Authorship Attributions in Middleton's Canon," and it assesses some of those theories for Middleton's co-authorship of Timon of Athens and his revision and adaptation of Shakespeare plays. I'm very open to the idea that Middleton has inserted the Hecate passages,
Hmm.
but irrespective of Shakespeare's intention, I agree that they if well, needless to say, if I was directing a production of Macbeth, I wouldn't be cutting those scenes.
Right, right.
I'd be making the most of them, and I would have a Hecate riding a giant cloud and witches zipping about on broomsticks scenes.
Nice, nice. So so our discussion in terms of Machiavellian villains, I think I need to ask the question, what makes a Machiavellian villain, say that three times fast,
Mm,
um, different from another kind of villain? And is
yeah.
Macbeth really Machiavellian? I mean, we can say, okay, so if Iago is a 10 on the Machiavellian scale,
Mm,
right?
mm,
He's scheming, he's in terms of what Machiavellian as a verb means to us,
mm,
rather than the idea of what Machiavelli necessarily recommended. Okay, let's separate those two things. Um,
mm,
is Macbeth really Machiavellian? Because there's nothing subtle
mm,
about what he does, is there? I mean, other than his naked grab for power,
mm.
is that enough to be Machiavellian, do you think?
Well, I think it's the unscrupulousness, and we were
Okay.
talking about Thomas Kyd's Lorenzo earlier,
Hmm.
and dispatching intermediaries, and the willingness to dispatch anyone who gets in his way, including his friend Banquo, and the murder of guests
Hmm.
and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I would certainly say he constitutes a Machiavellian villain,
Okay.
Macbeth. And another thing, when we're thinking about Machiavellian villains, is the notion of using religion as a political tool, and it's Richard III that pings for me. I know we're talking about Macbeth right now, but Richard III really
Hmm.
pings me with a scene that I find quite hilarious, where Richard is strided by two bishops and is pretending to be holier than thou and reading his Bible in order to dupe the public. And that strikes me as very Machiavellian.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Very, I guess manipulativeness is what
Yes.
I'm thinking of. And it's hard to see any of that kind of subtlety
Mm.
in Macbeth. I will tell you who I do think is a villain is Romeo.
Oh my gosh. But really,
I mean,
uh,
he
open the can of worms, Rachel. Romeo. Oh gosh. Okay. Hit me with
All
this.
right. First, he's got a really high death count. Six people die because of him. He's what, 16 at least? Seduces a 13-year-old girl. Not good. Not
It,
good. In a time when her getting pregnant would have ruined her.
mm,
Absolutely ruined her. And, a secret marriage may as well have been no marriage to a young pregnant woman who had gotten married without her parents' approval, without the banns, without any of that. And Tybalt is right. He's right to look at Romeo and go, that guy is up to no good.
this is this is quite the reading. This is quite the reading.
Up to no
Is it
good, gets his best friend killed, one of the best characters in the canon, let
the
alone Romeo and
Mercutio?
Juliet, Mercutio.
Yeah, yeah. I love there's a line from the writer John Dryden who says that Shakespeare had to kill Mercutio by Act Three, lest Mercutio killed Shakespeare. It's fascinating, isn't it, with Romeo and Juliet, as is the case with so many Shakespeare plays, it's fixated on the idea of time. So the word
Mhm,
time appears 103 times in Romeo and Juliet. And when you have a look at Shakespeare's sources, the events depicted in the Romeo or Romeus
mhm,
and Juliet narrative usually take place over a span of about 9 months. And I think Shakespeare conflates
mhm.
that to about 4 to 6 days. And we don't know Romeo's age in Shakespeare's plays. He's not explicit with that. In his sources, Juliet is usually about 16 years old.
Mhm.
And for me, I think that Shakespeare makes Juliet younger to contribute to that sense of haste, the 2 hours traffic of the
Right.
stage. That as you rightly point out, I think people, audience members, early moderners would have thought, my God, this is a very hasty, very young marriage that women
Yes.
would usually get married, I believe, in their early 20s, sort of
Right. Right.
statistically, that it
Yes.
was regarded as incredibly dangerous to bear a child prior to the
Mhm,
year of 16. And even Lord Capulet, who sometimes gets a bad rep as a patriarchal
mhm.
authoritarian figure, he does say to Paris, let 2 summers wither ere
Yes.
she be a bride. So initially he wants to delay that
Mhm,
prospective wedding, and then Tybalt gets bumped off, and I think it almost becomes a distraction tactic there. That
mhm.
Romeo, he's a complex character. I don't see him as a villain personally, but I more than respect I'm more than open to pursuing your theory further and cogitating on it afterwards.
Well, he behaves foolishly and selfishly.
Oh, and he's an
You
impulsive
know,
character. I
he's
like I
impulsive,
like to
but I understand that it's not he's not Machiavellian
no.
in that sense. Um, not as much as Hamlet, for instance, who,
Yes. Yeah.
is arguably a Machiavellian villain,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. Um,
And he says that Claudius popped between the election and my hope, that he did actually aspire to
yes,
the crown. People
yes.
forget that sometimes with Hamlet. But I think Juliet, just to go back to Romeo and Juliet for a
Hmm.
second, is the character who gets that play to motor along. And
Hmm.
she's a much
Yes.
more mature character than Romeo. And I often describe, in terms of maturity level,
Hmm.
Romeo as Cheddar to Juliet Stilton.
I don't know if she'd appreciate that.
Just as a metaphor. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yet she's not mature enough
No.
to save herself. And, or to recognize that Romeo is, what we would call today a fuckboy, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and in, I don't know if you have any daughters,
No.
but something happens when you have a daughter and they become about 13. And
Mm.
it happened a little earlier, a little later. But suddenly, your sweet little girl that everybody just kind of looked at like, oh, there's a sweet little girl, right? We're not talking about horrible people who look at children as sexual objects, but all of a sudden, they go through puberty and they become, you know, they get looked at as sexual prey. And something has to switch inside you, and again, today, any parent recognizes that they have to protect their daughter or their son, whatever, their children from sexual predators. But nonetheless, there is the way people perceive your daughter in public shifts dramatically after puberty. And when that happened, then I began to see Romeo and Juliet differently, and I began to feel a little more compassion towards Lord and Lady Capulet and their desperate measures to protect their daughter from
Mm,
being ruined or worse. And it happened, right?
mm,
Their worst fears were realized, and that any parent of a 13-year-old girl who had been sheltered, cosseted her entire life, barely went outside, never went anywhere unattended, and is suddenly being stalked by this teenage boy, you're going to put up every defense you can. And so I think that's when I started seeing Romeo as
uh,
as a villain,
it's a very cynical reading, but
rather than as
I
just
see where you're
a
coming from. Yeah.
misunderstood teenage boy who was in love. And I just don't believe it for a minute. He was in love with Rosalind, and then,
Yeah, yeah,
for whatever reason, Juliet caught his eye. Rosalind decided she'd rather be a nun, for and good for Rosalind, right?
yeah.
And so I I think it's kind of a litmus test of your point in life. I won't say maturity because that's not really what it is. It's just
No.
your place in your life circumstances as to how how you feel about Romeo. But anyway, we're going a little bit far afield here. Did you have any other villains that you wanted to?
No, 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 not for this episode, I don't think.
Okay.
I'm curious with the question we posed at the beginning of the episode, who is the baddest of them all? And I
Mm,
wonder, who do you consider to be the most villainous villain in Shakespeare? And it could very well be Romeo. You've had an impassioned rant about Romeo
no,
there,
no,
so
no, no, no. I think for me it's Iago. I think
yes,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
Iago is it for me. Yeah, um I mean he could easily give me nightmares like the and because I've met Iago
Yeah, yeah. I think everyone has.
over and over again, and
Yeah.
it's terrifying because they look so normal,
I
right?
think for me, I think for me, the character I would least want to meet in a dark alley would be Aaron from Titus Andronicus.
Hmm.
But the character I would least want in my professional network or social circle would be Yargo. But unfortunately, as you say, I have met a few Yargos, particularly in recent times, and they're deadly because
Yeah.
they will seduce the people that they want closest to them.
Hmm.
And once they're intent on your downfall, they're like a dog with a bone, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So beware not just of jealousy, the green-eyed monster, but viewers and listeners, beware of the Yargos in your life.
All right. Perfect. So let's see, what have we got next going here? Writer's Corner.
Yes, yes.
So what
So
what are you writing right now?
so I've been very busy with lots of public speaking engagements recently, which is lovely. So I'm still chipping away gradually at my Shakespeare and Panto book,
Hmm.
and the most recent chapter is in part drawing comparisons between the use of music and song in Shakespeare, particularly songs that would have likely been familiar to his audiences, and comparing
Hmm.
that to British pantomime, where you will often get familiar songs, sometimes with rewritten lyrics. So I've found it very interesting delving into what a playgoing experience from a musical perspective must have been like. That before you even went into the theatre, you would have a ballad monger, that you would have someone potentially singing the lamentable ballad of King Lear or Titus
Hmm.
Andronicus
Hmm.
before you went into the theatre
Hmm.
with the black flag snatching at the heavens and experienced that play. And how those ballads could enhance and be enhanced by the play-going experience, and then thinking about Shakespeare's use of ballad and songs within his dramas and his clever way of subversion. Othello is a great example, I think, where you have the Willow Song,
Mm.
where this was a known ballad concerning a male lamenting the loss of his lover, and Shakespeare reverses and inverts that by having Desdemona speak about her maid Barbary, and this song where a woman laments being deserted by her lover. So I was curious, Rachel, whether ballads or music during the early modern period, is that something that you've explored? It's not
Oh,
something that I've
definitely.
considered myself expert in,
Yeah,
so I was
definitely.
curious to hear your thoughts.
Not so much in the to the point of reading a lot of ballads, but what
Mm,
I can say is that ballad sheets were a common form of entertainment. So,
mm,
you know, publishers were always looking for things to print that they could sell quickly. And so something that was very common was ballad sheets. And these were kind of fairly large pieces of paper, very cheap paper, printed on
mm,
both sides. And on one side would kind of be the news of the day, any gossip, um, maybe recipes for something, who knows what, uh, just think of kind of like a community newsletter that you've got 20 people contributing to and they don't consult with each other. There isn't so much of an editor. And then on the other side was a ballad, kind of in the tradition of Weird Al Yankovic, where there was a common tune that everybody would have recognized, and then new lyrics put on top of that that might relate to events of the day, uh, might be about some story that was going around, or Pyramus and Thisbe, something from classical uh, stories or whatever. And these were tremendously popular, uh, and the forerunners of our modern newspaper. And
mm,
so, there was so much music in early modern time periods and before. People
yeah,
sang, people played music wherever they went. So these ballads, everybody would be reading the same one on the same day. And so, if you were a clever playwright, what you did is take one of those ballads and just put them in your play. There wasn't any
yeah.
copyright or anything like that. And then it acted as a kind of shorthand of, look, this is what my play is about. It's partly about this, um, the same thing that we're singing about in this ballad. And so, that would mean that the songs could change regularly. Again, depending on where you were, when you were, um, all all of that. So
Mm,
these, in a sense, newspapers are the descendant of ballads because the
mm,
ballads were the main event,
mm,
which is why they were called ballad sheets. And
mm.
so, these were considered disposable. Sure, a lot of people used them as toilet paper. Nice thin paper, probably ended up with a lot of ink on your parts, but better than leaves, I'm guessing. Uh, and it speaks to the high literacy rate, especially in London at the time, because you would have had nobody to sell all these ballads to if people couldn't read them, or at least have somebody read them to them. So yeah, musicality.
Mm.
I miss it in our instant musical world because people don't sing.
Yeah, yeah. But it's been really fun to approach and just get that sense of the musicality of
Well,
that
that's awesome.
theatre
That
going
sounds
experience.
fascinating. That
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
fascinating. So now I need to ask you, as a writer, a technical question, because I'm in the
Oh,
middle of putting out proposals for my next book. Um,
yes.
do you uh, Do you have a publisher yet? Have you sent out proposals? And if not, why not?
Watch this space. Not yet. Not yet confirmed. So
Okay, good, good, good,
I
good,
hope to have
good.
news anon. But not
Excellent.
yet. No, there's the peer review process, and yes. So fingers
So you're
crossed.
going through a whole like an academic.
Yes, yeah. Well, it was the same with my last book, Shakespeare's Borrowed
Hmm.
Feathers, that is a trade book, but you still go through the rigorous peer review
I see.
process, and is a long process, and it's work for the peer reviewers as well as the wonderful
Very much
editors and
so.
publishers, and
Mm,
it's a collaborative process. But I am about 50,000 words into this book now,
wow,
so uh yeah, so I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it.
that's awesome. I'm so glad to hear it and so looking forward to it.
And what about you? You as ever, you've got some
Busy, busy, busy. So
exciting irons in the fire. Yes.
so yeah, both my other books, they're off with the publisher. I can stop thinking about them for a little while. And now I am pursuing my interest in the history of silver
Mm.
and just sent out 4 proposals uh, this last yesterday. And even just writing the proposal is quite a process because
Oh yeah.
you need to come up with a synopsis. They want a table of contents with a paragraph about each chapter for a book that I have not finished writing about yet.
Yes.
Uh, you
Yeah.
know,
That's the
uh,
tricky thing, isn't it? Is
hmm
that they look for these comprehensive, detailed proposals, and for me, the research and the writing process go hand in hand, and I
yes,
often, which makes total sense, of course, have much better sense of a project when I've finished writing it,
definitely, definitely.
not
I mean,
before. It's a
I always
journey of discovery, I think.
I always have to rewrite the introduction after I've written the book. I have
Yeah,
to write the
yeah,
introduction at the beginning, or I don't know what I'm writing about.
yeah,
And then and then at the end I go, "Oh, that's what I was writing about."
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah. So
rewrite
who've
that
you sent,
introduction.
when you say you've sent off 4 proposals, are these to
Mhm.
publishers or literary agents or,
These are to publishers. I've
yeah,
looked for a literary agent. It's even harder to find than a publisher for the kind of
yeah,
books that we write. Um,
yeah,
you know, won't go into all that necessarily, but just suffice it to say that if you're writing a history book, there's very few agents that are interested in representing you,
historical non-fiction, yeah,
historical
yeah,
nonfiction.
yeah,
But there are some wonderful publishers, and they don't require agents to approach them. They
mm,
understand the industry better than I do, obviously, and so it's not that hard to get your work in front of a publisher who does historical nonfiction. Unlike writing fiction, which you almost absolutely have to have an agent for. So it's not too bad in that, you can write one proposal and then basically cut and paste for each
mm,
publisher's requirements of what they're looking for. And I have a couple publishers that are high on my wish list, but I won't say what they are. And
of course.
it could be months before I hear anything. And so
Yes.
I will just keep working on the book. And
It sounds amazing. You just sort of banging out one smash hit after the other. But the
oh,
history of
thank you.
silver, I mean, that what an incredible topic. And yeah,
Well,
I'm
it's so
excited for that one.
exciting. And
Yeah,
like any other book that we want to write, right? I started writing it because I couldn't find a book that
yeah,
covered what I
yeah,
wanted it to cover. And it's a topic that is very timely.
yeah.
Um, not only did silver kind of decide the fate of and scholars don't at me, but had a major effect on the course of Roman history. Um,
Mm.
the Silk Road, not to mention Spain and of course, South America and the United States and the UK and everything else in between. But where was I going with?
You were just
Anyway,
giving us a
yeah,
whistle-stop tour of the history of silver.
it's
Yeah.
it's it's super fascinating. Oh, I know what I was getting at. That in the present day, silver underlies the technology of the internet and of solar cells. So in many ways, we are just as dependent now on silver as the Romans were in terms of how we expand our reach out into the world. And I found that connection so fascinating that that it compelled me to write this book. So I just finished the Roman chapter after going through the Hittites, and the Anatolians, of course, the Greeks and the Macedonians. And next I'm headed out on the Silk Road, and I could not be more excited. There is
Wow.
hardly any period in history more interesting than that.
Oh, wow.
And then because I always have to be writing two books at once, uh, I'm looking at esoterica in Shakespeare. And so I'm looking at that land sovereignty issue around Macbeth. I think that's really
Ah,
fascinating. I'm interested in the subtext of alchemy in Romeo and Juliet
yes,
and Shakespeare's use of fools as psychopomps. I think
yes.
deserves at least a chapter in a book. And so I'm kind of ping-ponging back and forth between those, depending on which part of my brain wants to work at that
Yes,
any
yeah,
given
yeah.
moment.
Just how you feel that day. So yeah,
Exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly,
Silver psychopomp.
exactly, exactly. Get my
Hmm.
1,000 words in and then go on with my day. Yeah.
And in terms of this episode topic, if they're thinking about Shakespeare's villains, were there
hmm
any particular books or essays you consulted for this episode?
Of course, I recommend that you read The Prince. You know,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
this that it has persisted to this day. It's fascinating stuff, and hopefully at some point in the future, it won't be so relevant to what's happening in the United States. Um,
Very opposite.
it's
Yes, yes.
worth a read. Worth a read
Yeah.
if you want to be
Give it a skim. A skim,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, politically literate in the 21st century and contemplating what's happening in the United States. Yeah, give it a read.
History recurs, yes.
hmm
1513, we think he wrote it, the Prince, but here we are, 2026.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of recommendations for viewers and listeners. Maurice Charney, Shakespeare's Villains, that was
hmm
published by Bloomsbury in 2011. On the subject of Niccolo Machiavelli, the classic study uh, in terms of perceptions and the influence of Machiavelli on Tudor culture would be Edward Meyer's Machiavelli and the Elizabethan Drama. That was
mm
published by Felber in 1897. And more recently is Machiavellian Encounters in Tudor and Stuart England, Literary and Political Influences from the Reformation to the Restoration. And that's edited by Alessandro Arienzo and Alessandra Petrina. That was published by Ashgate in 2013. And I was speaking a little bit about Lorenzo as the prototypical Machiavellian schemer in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. I would recommend checking out Lucas Erne's superb book, Beyond the Spanish Tragedy, a study of the works of Thomas Kyd, which was published by Manchester University Press in 2001. And another great study of Lorenzo and the sensational sensationally lethal turn in his villainy,
mm.
to paraphrase this essay, is Alfred Harbage's Intrigue in Elizabethan Tragedy, which was published in Essays on Shakespeare and Elizabethan Drama in honor of Hardin Craig by University of Missouri Press in 1962.
Awesome. And I think, did I mention the paintings behind us? I think I forgot. I try to do that at the beginning.
Yes, yes, yes. What is it?
So behind Darren is Giotto's Rite of the Last Judgment with the detail of hell, and behind me is Peter Huys' Inferno. We chose them to depict villainy for us. This is what happened, according to Dante, if you were a bad person.
Yes, delightful. Well, maybe that's not the right choice of words, but they're very pretty. Uh, well, we've reached the end of this episode. Thanks and ever thanks to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. Until the next time, it's a warm farewell from Rachel and me.
Bye bye.